We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
Looks like the rain has
Hey everybody, it's
gone.
Boysen Hodgson. Welcome back to the Mankind Podcast, the podcast where we are setting out to prove that there is more than one way to be a man. We are deconstructing and complicating ideas about manhood and masculinity and bringing you lots of interesting conversations. I'm looking forward to today's conversation as well. Today, I've got Jason Frishman. Jason, say hello.
Hey everyone, how y'all doing?
Jason and I ran into each other because of some other folks who were involved in men's work. So first thing I want to say is this is going to be a conversation about men's work with context, conversation about men's work and parenting, fathering, conversation about men's work and narrative, conversation about men's work and getting out of our stories, retelling stories, deconstructing stories. There's going to be a lot of that in this. Jason wants to jump right in.
Uncovering our stories.
Uncovering our stories. Nice.
Uncovering.
Jason Frishman has been working
we're not discovering.
for 2 decades supporting individuals, groups, families, and organizations and businesses. He brings 20 years of work in offices, institutions, kitchens, farmers markets. We're going to talk about food today. Woodlots and boardrooms to wild new environments, whether as a psychotherapist, the creator and founder of Journeyman and the Mug Club, a public speaker and a narrative consultant. Jason believes that our lives are adventurous and we can and should be an active, engaged author of our own adventure stories. If you listen to the Mankind podcast, that may sound familiar to what Brandon says at the end. So pick up the pen and write your life. Yes. Jason, welcome.
Thank you, boys, and that was great. It's nice to hear all that stuff.
So first thing is Jason and I met because of a couple of our mutual friends, Ken Mossman and Sean Harvey, who got together what they called an elder men's retreat, which is not necessarily old men, but guys who have been around men's work for a long time. And we had this incredible weekend of kind of looking for multiple perspectives at like, what does the field of men's work look like? What is the future? What are some of the realities? What are some of the obstacles? And that is the context in which Jason and I met. And I also just want to say, Jason and I really met and I began to understand who Jason is over food. So let's talk about why is farmers markets in kitchens and farmers markets in your bio? Let's start there.
Well, on top of stories, adventures, and helping and serving people, food and cooking and serving people has always been a real passion of mine. So years and years ago, when I was working full-time as a therapist in Boston, I was also working 35 hours part-time at a restaurant in Harvard Square. And I learned to cook when I was in Israel across, many, many years ago. And I learned it from my grandmother and my mother. And, the act of breaking bread, or gluten-free bread as it may, the act of sharing a meal to me is one of the most profound experiences that humans can share together. We all have to eat. And there is so much complexity involved in what, how, where, and why we eat what we eat, that it's fascinating. And so farmers markets, my wife and I had a small food business for many years, where I had created a number of different products, and at the same time was creating sandwiches at the farmers market. I was doing workshops on traditional preservation of methods in terms of bone broths and fermentation and all of these things. I was teaching a lot of the local restaurants how to do these things, to add it to their food, their menus and their food plans. And frankly, the idea of serving and feeding people is inherent even in the men's work I do, the metaphor and the story of the mug club, and the way we met. You know, when Ken and Sean invited me, I said, I will come if I can cook a meal on Saturday. That was I don't know any of these guys, but I want to serve them food. I want to feed them.
And an unbelievable meal it was. So there's this idea. So the word that keeps coming to me is nurturing, nourishing. And in meeting you and getting to know you a little bit, like that is something that just keeps standing out to me, is that everything you do, you bring this perspective of nourishment through story, through food, through connection, through journeyman, through, you know, the mug club, which we'll talk about as well. That's just like who you are. So how's that fit with men's work? So now do men's work and nourishment.
Well, to me, it's actually, they're intertwined in a beautiful way. Is, you know, you started by saying, you know, there's more than one way to be a man. And that's true. You know, that there is that. And what, unfortunately, well, for better, for worse, right? You know, based on the time and context, we have had certain limited ways of being men in our culture for a long, long time. I do believe that one of the very inherent pieces, one of the ways, you know, we've talked about men as providers and when, you know, all of these things, but men, we have the capacity, the capability, and the need to be nourishers, to provide nourishment, right? Whether it is the story of going out and hunting and bringing back the meat, or, you know, or money and bringing home the bacon, you know, that metaphor. But what about at home, right? Like, how many men can have their kids, you know, crawl into their lap and get nourishment just like that, or serve breakfast, or, you know, the idea of nourishing is something that, for me, it goes back to our core. As men, we nourish others, I believe. And the beautiful piece about it is that when I get to do that, it also strengthens me. It creates a sense of place and character and meaning that deepens everything else I do. And frankly, it's cutting up vegetables. I mean, you know, when I used to teach a lot about fermentation, the idea of fermentation is a powerful metaphor. And I also think about fermentation. If you ferment things, you are a social activist. If you're a connected man, you are a social activist. And the metaphors there are very powerful. And so when I used to talk about fermentation, I used to say to people, like, by doing this, you are stepping in a different direction than mainstream culture, which is giving us, you know, homogenized, dead, you know, mass-produced foods. And you are going to a depth and a richness. And the exact same thing happens when we stop to connect with the people around us. And so nourishment is and frankly, I used to joke. I said, listen, people have hired me and paid me a lot of money to basically tell them to put salt on vegetables. So just like men's work and food and all of those things, there's a simplicity and a depth that gets me really excited. I just think that there's a lot of potential in how we can become nourishers as men.
Yes. If you're a conscious man, you're an activist, is what I just heard you say. That is so profound. That is
a connected
so
man.
Connected
man.
You're an activist. Yes. So I'm going to dig even deeper, right? That there's a depth to. You and I have also had a lot of fun playing around with this, the hero's journey. So you have been an outside observer of the Mankind Project for a long time, and
yes,
and this thing, right? So what came to me is, for thousands of years, men have been warriors. There's this kind of thing that runs through the Mankind Project. But what I hear you saying is that for thousands of years, for much longer, for hundreds of thousands of years, men have been nourishers. Men have been breaking ground and putting seeds. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Keep going.
Yeah. We've been tricksters. We've been, connected. We've been, the idea of not just the warriors and the kings, but we've been tricksters. We've been healers. We've been shaman. We've been connected. And that is equally, and if not more powerful, because we can, there are more stories we can live than just the ones we've been given. And so this idea that, oh man, the hero's journey, it's wonderful. I mean, I love it. I was just showing you before we started talking, I wrote my dissertation from the perspective of the hero's journey.
Yeah.
But you're right. I have been an outside observer of Mankaja for years. Before Journeyman started, it's probably the one national, international men's program that I would recommend to other people.
Thank you.
And yet I was, when we started, when I knew you were coming to that weekend, I was like, on the one hand, I told you this when we met, I was a little starstruck because I've been getting your emails forever, but I was also, I can't wait to give him crap about the hero's journey. And I can't wait to talk about it because there is so much more.
Right.
And that story has become dominant and oppressive.
Nice. And I think that what I really enjoyed about getting to know you and continue to enjoy about getting to know you is that it's true of so many things. When I look at something from the outside and just look at the narrative that's kind of most present in the culture about it, that's usually only a small percentage of what's actually going on, right? So we've been able to kind of dive deeper into what I think is more meaningful, more prescient for what's going on in MKB. I have to say one other thing about food before I move on to narrative therapy, narrative coaching. Here's a metaphor. This is a metaphor. So one of the things that you brought to the Elder Men's Retreat, speaking of fermented things, was a pepper sauce.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Tell me about the pepper sauce, and then I want to make a comment on it.
Sure. I love heat. I love chilies. I do a lot of that. And a good friend of mine who lives here, who I've known for years, also does. And so we grow, between the two of us, probably 20 plus varieties of chili peppers. And at the end of the year, end of the season, we do a number of things, drying them, smoking them. But my favorite is I ferment them. So I make a pepper mash, and I make usually like 2 quarts of solid, nothing else in it but peppers and salt. And then I have it for the year, where I can then take bits out and handcraft a spicy sauce or a chutney or a hot sauce to pair with whatever meal I'm making, because I've got this wonderful base metaphor. And I have it for the year. And so for this meal that we did, I brought that because I was doing a meal that had, now I won't say it was an Indian food meal, because it was certainly all sorts of other influences, but right. I might say it's Indian styled.
Yeah.
And so I made a chutney with it. And the idea, I love hot food, but I never want something that's hot for the sake of hot. Again, metaphor. But I made it really flavorful and so it tied together all the different dishes. And again, that's the way I look at the meal, and that's the way I look about human interactions, and that's the way I look at stories, is what are the things that pull together all the different pieces, and how can we share in that? And also, how can you add a little or a lot, or what you need? You add what you need and what you want.
Yeah.
But you're right. It's funny that you're asking about that, because now that you say that, I remember there was a lot of commenting about that sauce.
And there's a nothing wasted about it too. Like it was, here's the scraps, here's the end bits, here's what's left after we've done all the macro processing of all of our 20x varieties of peppers. Here's the tips and tails, and we make this
100%.
Make this incredible thing that, yeah, as you said, it's like it was the thread that ran through many of the dishes. And then, I put a big spoonful on the side of my plate just so that I could be dipping everything else into that chutney.
Mm-hmm.
It's just amazing. So it's more on nourishing. So
And
you're
you're right about using everything. Sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt, but yes,
Yeah.
I forgot about that. The tips and the tails, and yes, though this idea of like everything can be useful, and that's a big
metaphor.
obvious
Another
statement.
metaphor.
But
Yes.
yeah, yes, exactly.
Yeah, every little piece can be useful, and following those tastes, right? Following those different
Yeah.
threads through the different places we show up. So you're a clinical guy. You've been a psychologist. Is that what you are?
Yes.
You've
Yep.
been a
I in Vermont, I have to say doctorate level psychologist, because Vermont has one of the few states that licenses masters and doctorate. So I have to say a doctorate level psychologist, but I'm a psychologist by training. I've been doing that for about 25 years.
And then let's add narrative to that. So what is a narrative? What's a narrative clinician? What's a narrative therapist? And then we'll go to coaching from there.
Okay, and I'm going to add to that really. I'm going to answer your question, and I'm not going to derail us, but I'm going to put a seed for a future.
Yes.
So my doctorate, I focused on narrative and postmodern therapy, but my master's, I have a master's degree in adventure therapy. So I'm an adventure therapist and a narrative therapist by training. So that's important. It'll probably come back later. But narrative, clinical narrative work is very different than a lot of typical traditional psychotherapies, right? Psychotherapies typically, they're coming from a medical model. They're coming from a place of what locating issues and struggles within the person. And I'm vastly generalizing, but oftentimes I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm struggling. Narrative therapy really locates problems between people and in the context and the social environment. And so, one in narrative, one of the primary sort of kitschy phrases is the person is not the problem is the problem.
Thank you.
And that makes sense to a lot of people, but it is radically different than a lot of traditional typical therapies. And so the idea is that who we are and the reality that we're in is truly made up by the stories that we tell about ourselves and that others tell about us. And so our reality can truly change by the way that we make meaning of our stories and the interaction of stories between and among people. So that's really powerful, right? And it's a little bit, it goes back to social activism, right? It goes, because if my stories are that powerful, I can change the world. I can change my world for sure. Mm-hmm. And so this idea of like how we live and how we choose and how we share whom we are and our stories can develop not just us, but the people around us and the interaction between all of the people we love and care about.
That was beautifully well said. And it connects me to this idea of like, at its heart, that's what the mythopoetic men's work, mythopoetic, that was the intention, right? Is to look at stories outside. So maybe it's not my story, but I'm looking at a story over there, looking at a myth and doing that same thing. Oh, yes. What is the meaning that I can draw from this? What are the metaphors that I can pull out? How does this relate to me? What is the direction that I want to go? So narrative therapy is really honing in on that, sounds like.
Yes, and then I love mythopoetic work, but the thing that I would add, I think, is that narrative therapy, and I'm oversimplifying, but what you were saying, mythopoetic is like, all right, let's talk about this myth and what can I gain from that? How can it develop? Narrative therapy acknowledges that and goes there, but also goes in the other direction. How can my story impact myth? Like we are connected on that level.
Tell me more about that. Yeah, tell me more.
Yeah. I mean, our stories, my own backstory, or even the current story that I'm living, will have an impact on, let's just say, on my son's interpretation of Loki and Norse mythology. because of who I am and who I represent to them. And then they take that, so the mythopoetic movement is like, all right, let me read Iron John or any of these things and talk about how those stories might have teaching and might alchemically, change who I am. Narrative therapy will recognize that it can go in both ways, and that all of our stories are interconnected in a really and truly powerful way. It takes a brand new, in my opinion, in my experience, and in the work I do, it takes a very different look at archetypes. It takes a very different look at, the interaction between big cultural stories and narratives and my own personal ones, right? The interaction of the social construction of things, right? How do we build what a man should be and what a man should do, and how does that look in my life when I can't do that, or and how does that teach my kids, or all like the interaction between and among stories goes multi-directional. Does that make sense?
Totally.
Because I'm going into weird places in my
head, it was just, welcome to the esoteric conversation about narrative and storytelling. We're glad that you're here. Now we'll all slow down and take a breath. As you're speaking about that, what I love is how much freedom that gives me and that gives each of us to really look at every single story that we're telling and hearing from a perspective of this re-narration, of this retelling, of this breaking down, right? So what you said about how does your interpretation of a myth impact your son's view on Loki, as an example.
Right.
That's so cool. It's kind of like, wow. So my interpretation of popular cultural structural stories, whatever is happening out there, is not only informed by my interpretations or the meaning that I'm making from it, but also my dad's or my mom's, or any of the stories that I've been told about the stories.
Yes. I'll give you a great example. This is one of my favorites, is I'm not a sports guy, which all of a sudden flies in the face of lots of masculine things. I'm not a sports guy.
Right.
When I grew up, my family was not a sports guy. None of them were. My dad, my mom, not into it. I had great friends who were. I'd go over to their houses and be forced to watch lots of games. But I grew up in a house where we didn't watch any sports. But my dad loves chili, beer, and wings. So every year he would host a stupid bowl party. Everyone else is hosting Super Bowl parties. He hosts a stupid bowl party where he invited everyone who doesn't care about the game and one couple that did. And he made chili and wings and all the things, and he had a Super Bowl party. And we had the sound off for the game and the sound on for the commercials. And of course, the one couple that cared about the game had to have a good sense of humor about it.
Yeah.
But I grew up, and the message I got is that this sports thing, it's secondary to the meal, to the gathering, and to the connections. And so now, today, clearly everything we're talking about, I can look through that one story and make a lot of different sense about where I feel about sports. My kids are really into sports, and I am a cut up the oranges and go watch them play kind of dad, because I love them. But I'm always bringing the oranges, not literally, but I'm always bringing the nourishment, and I'm always, ready to be there to connect. And that's what's more important to me than, winning, so to speak.
Thank you. Hey, it's Boysen here with the Mankind Podcast. We are closing in on 100 5-star reviews of this podcast, and we have a goal. Brandon and I want to get to 250 5-star reviews. So help us out, will you? Please go to the Mankind Podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave us a review. Thank you. So now I got a grasp on narrative therapy, and let's move into kind of coaching. So you've kind of been moving toward a coaching model, group coaching model. We'll talk about the Mug Club, talk a little bit about Journeyman. What's the difference between narrative therapy and narrative coaching?
It's a Great question, because, on the one hand, I've been trying to figure that out since I started coaching. And I've also I showed you before this, there's a book that I've been reading about, I think it's a fine line. Coaching for me, and I am a coach, but I am not a certified coach. I have 2 degrees and 25 years of working with people, so I thought that would be useful. But coaching for me allows the sort of creativity and broadening of being able to both be myself more, right? In the therapy world, in narrative therapy, I'm more removed. I'm more, it's more, the process of the client, and I'm there to, help them move through it.
Yeah.
In coaching, I can be more present. My coaching clients know about my kids. They know about some of my own struggles, right? Because I'm a man. I'm also one of the journeymen. I'm also more directive in coaching. But more importantly, I think around narrative coaching is the interplay of stories and other men's stories they can share with one another in a much more powerful sense. So, in therapy, in my therapy practice, I do mostly individual work.
Yeah.
I have done some group therapy, and I love group therapy. But when I started Journeyman, a lot of the conventional suggestions around coaching is do it with individuals first till you get your model down, then you can scale by doing a group and blah blah blah. And that made sense. But for me, for men, group coaching is the thing that I know, after doing this for 25 years, is the thing that's going to be most useful for men. So while I do some individual coaching, my focus is on the group because of the community. So I'll tell a quick story. That years ago, I'm sitting with a therapy client in my office, and he's telling me, great weekend, hanging out with his buddies, all the things you might expect a bunch of guys to be doing in the woods, hanging out for the weekends. But then his face fell, and he said, yeah, but all that was great, but if my wife left me, I wouldn't have anyone to tell. After just telling me 20 minutes ago all these great guys that he spent time with. And it hit me 2 things. Number one, that's heartbreaking. And I've heard that from men before in my therapy office. But the thing that really hit me was on the other side of my office door, and I knew he was there because I've seen him for years. He's always early. But on the other side of my office door was going to be a man who was sitting that if I could literally open the door and say, you two talk, they would have much less and much different need for me. Because the therapeutic thing is all about our relationship, and that's useful and valuable in and of itself. But the community and the allies and the connections that I believe that men are bullied out of in our culture, is much more necessary for the vast majority of men. And so that was in many ways the birth of Journeyman, and the decision to I got to do this differently. I got to get away from the medical model. Going back to the idea that the problem is in you, that pathology is in you. Right. No, there's something broken in our bigger system. And in Journeyman and coaching, I'm able to speak to that and have men speak to that. So fast forward.
Yes.
I've had, for the last couple of years, every Tuesday at 1 is an open meeting of anyone who's gone through Journeyman. Anyone can show up that's done it. And there's no agenda. It's just, let's talk. Well, in November, I sent every Tuesday I send a reminder out, and one guy hit reply all, and he said, I can't make it today, but this went down at my house, and I'd love to get some feedback. Right? So men that he didn't know, men that are on this list, responded and were answering and one guy who I know he didn't know, has never been at the Tuesday meeting together, they'd never met. One guy responded and gave some good advice, but also said, here's my phone number, please call me, let's talk. And I come to find out that they have now had multiple conversations. So again, in narrative coaching, that can happen. And in therapy, not without a lot of bureaucratic paperwork. I can't do that. And I can say, I told you this the last time you and I talked, but I can say that after 25 years of being a doctorate level psychologist, barring severe clinical anxiety, depression, barring severe, mental health issues, what men need more than anything else is this type of coaching, is the community. It is the gathering, the togetherness, and the facilitation of being able to talk about these stories and how do we do differently. That's more important than anything I've ever done in my therapeutic space.
What do you think has happened in our culture, especially Western capitalist culture? I don't know why I threw that in, but there's bell hooks is ringing in
I
my
think it's
head.
there.
White supremacist
Mm-hmm.
capitalist patriarchy ringing in my head.
Mm-hmm.
What is it about our culture that has moved us so far away from what you just said, like 25 years of experience? And what you've come to realize is we need to sit down and talk and be connected to each other in community.
Yeah.
What's happened to us?
Gosh. Well, I definitely have thoughts and ideas, but yeah, we should have hours of conversation of that. But I think in short, I think capitalism was a good word to throw in. I think there has been a domination-based ideology that has been in play for a very long time. I'm not good with dates, but a long, long time. And, because of that, we have had like if we think about it, the history of our culture, of our country, was about domination, right? We ran away from oppression so that we can then come here and oppress everyone else. And then our country and Western culture has slowly infiltrated all over the world. Yeah. And we've lost touch with some of these other less dominant stories, right? Going back to stories that are told most often become dominant and oppressive to other ones, right? So that's everything from the hero's journey to, what the roles and responsibilities for men are versus women versus this. I think that there has been a long history of othering that serves power and simultaneously a pushing down of anything that speaks truth to power, right? The emperor wears no clothes. And that's actually something that I think as men we have lost. It goes back to trickster archetypes, right? The trickster speaks truth to power. Mm-hmm. But the king and the warrior don't want to hear that. And so this idea of we have had an unbalanced story, we've had an unbalanced set of stories for so long that now you hear people saying, well, that's human nature. Like we have now put, man box culture, we've now put patriarchal culture into biology where it does not live and it does not belong.
That's beautiful. So we're 30 minutes in. I'm loath to shift too far. So there's a thing that comes up in me is like, wow, we need to be telling more stories. I need to be telling more stories of interdependence. I need to be telling more stories of connection. I need to be telling more stories of softness. I need to be telling more stories of domesticity is a word that just came up for me. Yes. In order to make these kinds of shifts, right? There's something very earthy and grounded about the stories that are being called for or called forth from us.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. And domesticity, it's so interesting you say that, because as soon as you say that, many people immediately think of women.
Right.
Domestic, we have a book on our shelf upstairs called Radical Homemaking. And it's an empowerment book for women, but it's one of my favorite books because, frankly, I'm the cook in our house. I don't do all the domestic. My wife does most of it, and we talk about that, and that's some of our challenges, of course. Yeah. But like this idea of the everyday and the mundane being important for us, for men, right? Like you're right, more stories of connection, more stories of domesticity, more stories of, the simplest way I put it, which is, again, going back to hero's journey, is while the hero's off saving the world and battling dragons. What about the rest of us who are staying home and wiping butts, doing dishes, and tending to the garden? Like, don't we deserve adventure and magic every day as well? And how powerful that can be. And frankly, I do know that if we do focus on the domesticity, the interconnectedness, the interdependence, like you're saying, we're actually more primed for epic, legendary things. And so we need both, you know? And yet, in the hero's journey, the most we ever get of these kinds of stories that you're mentioning is a 3-minute montage or flashback. So it's relegated to be like, oh yeah, that happened, maybe. But right now we're saving the world.
So funny. I'm jumping into Tolkien, and everyone comes to Frodo's house and kind of crashes and creates the dinner party, right? And that's actually
100%.
That is actually the foundation for everything that happens after that, is because they created a circle over food.
Yep. Yes. In fact, that is one of the main reasons why Journeyman is about an inn and the mug club. That is like that exact scene is one of the reasons why what I do is how I do it, or something like that. That doesn't make sense. But, you know, it's one of the reasons why I chose the guiding metaphor for the work I do.
So
Because
new title for a book, The Alchemical Power of Everyday Activities.
I'm writing that down because I actually have been outlining a book, and I've been struggling with the sort of angle and thing, and that I may steal that from you and ask for a forward from you.
It's the gift. Let's talk about mental health. So we're in May. We're mid-May.
Yeah.
May is Mental Health Month. Then we go into June. June is Men's Health Month, and Father's Day is in June, and these things happen in June. I want to talk about men's work and fathering, because that has been a place where you have really invested a lot of time, and you have a really cool perspective on it. It's not like two separate things out there. We go off and do our men's work, and then there's this fathering thing. So talk about men's work for fathers.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, similar to what we were talking about before, where I say that, like, I really think for our mental health, it's not just about locating it within us in therapy, but it's really about interconnection, independence. In fatherhood or fathering, you know, I said to you beforehand that fathering as a verb is a really potent way of describing kind of what we can do. Even if you're not a father, right?
Yeah.
You are fathering. You know, you are bringing something forth. You are caretaking. You are nurturing and nourishing. You know, this is the essence of fathering for me. And you know, when it comes to mental health, I think I once worked for a physician that said something beautiful. He said, the worst thing that the medical world ever did is cut the head off the body.
Wow. Yeah.
Because our minds, the psychology, and our bodies and our interactions are, you know, is a holistic way of looking at our health, right? So mental health creates a division. And, you know, this idea that it's interesting to me, right? There's a division between mental health and physical health, and yet mental health lives in the medical model. So we've got some real problems there. There's some inherent flaws to that. But mental health for men, for fathers, is I believe, really intimately connected with the way that we are intimately connected, right? Or the lack thereof, right? And so I think a lot about when men who are fathers, like, so for example, like you're asking, you know, mental health for fathers, you know, development. Journeyman in the work I do is, sure, we help with parenting, but it really is about developing the man who happens to be a father, because then you'll be a better father, a better partner, a better community member, a better employee, you know, all of these things. But what that does is it involves the witnessing, or as in narrative therapy, we use the word witnessing,
Oh,
play with
okay.
words a lot.
Yeah.
So not just witnessing, but witnessing. I didn't make that up, but when you're witnessing, when you're with someone,
Mm-hmm.
their story impacts you and vice versa. Right. So one of the mottos of Journeyman is your work is our work. Your journey is our journey. And by doing that and by leaning into that, our own mental health improves because we're seen. We are heard. We are, again, if our, what we said a while back, if our realities and ourselves are based on the stories that we tell and are told about us, well, when we do that and it's facilitated, then we can change the reality of how we feel about things, how we interact about things. There's a quote from Ellen Langer, which I'm going to get a little bit wrong. She's a positive psychologist. She's considered the mother of positive psychology.
Okay.
And there's a quote that basically says, without crisis or engagement in psychotherapy, we rarely redefine and I'm messing the quote up, but we rarely reorganize our backstories. Sometimes
Yeah.
we call our backstories forward to justify or rationalize things, but we rarely go back and reorganize them.
Yes.
And that's powerful, especially if it's being witnessed.
Yes. And it seems to me that in that process of facilitated work, of group work, of moving together work, that we get to shape each other in those ways too, right? So I could put together a group of men and reinforce your negative victim narratives about what happened to you when you were a child all day and leave you worse at the end of the day.
And everybody else in the group would be left worse because we would all have that impact. It's rippled. And so, yes, this idea of, it was really powerful. That slogan that I mentioned around like your work is our work, your journey is our work, comes from a therapy group that I ran years ago where a guy came in, it had hit the fan at his house and he was like spilled in group. And then towards the end, he said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I just used up the entire group time. I'm really sorry." Because as men, we're taught to be small, and he like recognized he took up space and felt bad about it. And one of the other group members, and I'll never forget it, this was probably 18 years ago, 15 years ago, he said to him, "Listen, did you notice that as you were talking, everyone was nodding? Did you notice that so-and-so over there was crying? Did you know your work is our work? As you speak, we all change." And that has been incredibly powerful. And I get to see it. I get to see it in Journeyman, every time we run a group, every time there's this, we have text threads in Journeyman.
Yeah.
And I was telling my wife the other day, like, I have the honor of seeing men be open, vulnerable, and authentic on text in a way that most men never are in any way. And it's just like the most sacred honor that I get to be a part of.
So direct speak to the listeners out there. I'm just going to take this out of what you were just saying is like, take the permission to actually share, take up space and take up time in this way because your work is my work. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes.
And we get to build each other. We get to build each other in these ways. And connected and conscious, we have a responsibility. This is the other thing I will say. And this is like the men's work piece, right? We have a responsibility to one another to lift, to encourage, to challenge, to deconstruct these narratives that reorganize that. I love that word, actually, reorganize these narratives.
Yeah. And it is a responsibility. And I think that is the piece. Again, it goes back to different archetypes and different things, but there is a responsibility. We can talk about responsibility on a lot of levels, right? White men have been the cause of lots of troubles in our culture. So as a white man myself, I have a responsibility to fix some things. And it goes back to men's work as social action, connected fathers as activists. Like, even if I'm not out there protesting or whatever, by doing it differently with my kids, I'm changing the world.
Yeah.
And so we do have this responsibility. And so take it, right? Like with other men, with the guys that you go away for the weekend and just hang out in the woods and do things. But, tell them you love them. Tell them that crap is going down and you'd like to share it. Like, take that opportunity. And by doing that, you are changing things. Yourself, others, all of these things. It's incredibly powerful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to say this is a callback to something you said. So what was the woman's name? The mother of positive psychology?
I believe it's Ellen Langer. I have it actually right here, so let me make sure to get it right. Yes, Ellen Langer, Langer.
Okay. So I just want to say Martin Seligman's name gets bandied about, the father of positive psychology, over and over and over. I have never heard that woman's name before.
Yeah. And she is incredible. She has done things. She did. I can't speak much to her because I've actually only discovered her recently myself. But she did a research thing where, through the power of mindfulness, people who took part in the research physically looked younger. Like, that's like, in terms of positive psychology and the idea of the power of the mind and mindfulness and your own story and age. She works a lot with aging, but she is, any of your listeners who have an interest in that kind of topic, she's incredible. She really is.
I can't let it go without saying, so not debunk, but let's peel apart like toxic positivity and positive psychology, because positive psychology gets bandied about as like, no, just be happy kind of thing. That ain't it, kid. So say a little more about that.
Yeah. And the context in what I'm about to say comes from the fact that I heard that too. And so for a long time, my own teenage oppositionality was like, I'm not even going to study positive psychology. That I don't like it. I don't want to go there because it's not just, Pollyanna-ish. And frankly, what got me to start reading a little bit about positive psychology is the similarity in narrative therapy. People critique narrative therapy because they say, oh, you just want to find a more positive story? You want to find a happier story? And I'm like, no, it's not that. Right? In the same way that in positive, it's not just think good thoughts and it's in many ways there's such a similarity between positive psychology and narrative therapy in that we're not looking just to be like smile through it.
Yeah.
No, it's about how do we look for meaning and value? How do we look for, I like to say the magic is in the muck. Right? And so it's not about saying, well, the muck doesn't exist and this is great. It's about saying, like, I'm in the muck and this stinks, and right, that and is very important, right? It doesn't end with things are great. It doesn't end with things stink. There's always the cycling of things, and we can understand that and know that we can move towards, and we can move, we can learn from it. Like the gifts of the muck are what bring about our next sort of. Going back to adventures, right? More often than not, when you have a challenge, the thing you get out of the challenge helps you with the next challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like you got this magic thing and now you have a key and now you're stuck and oh my God, my key fits in this door. Hey, so.
Hey, yes, exactly that. And the reorganization of the stories is, I'm no mud, no lotus. So now we're going Far East metaphors and Far East storytelling, right? The horse ran away story. You lost your horse's story.
It's my favorite. Yeah.
Right. That thing. Is it good?
It might be good. Could be bad.
Could be bad. I don't know. Right. And it's like, that's the perspective. Like everything that happened to me as a kid, like the what actually happened may not be changeable, right? What actually happened, but I have no idea as a 53-year-old man what actually happened. All I have is a story about that I've told myself over and over about what happened.
Yes.
And that's actually a place of power to be able to.
Yes.
Yeah. Look at that.
And you can reorganize. You can look back at your 10-year-old self with the memory of the story, because the story and the events, the facts, the plot line is really only a memory of a story of a story of a memory.
Yes.
And so with your now 50 years, 3 years of life experience, you can input and understand and expect different contexts must have happened in that thing at 10 years old.
Right.
And so now all of a sudden the story comes through your timeline in a different way.
Yes.
It's not erasing it,
Right.
like we're not going to just say, oh, that chapter was terrible, let's rip it out of the book. But let's review it and look at it in a different way and understand that it is, again, because it became a dominant story, it is oppressive of other elements of who you are and who you can be. So let's unleash that by removing the sort of oppressive story that takes away everything else. Doesn't mean we take it out. We don't rip it out of the book. Anyway, yes. Sorry.
49 minutes into the conversation, mark that one as one of the clips that needs to be taken out, right? Because it became the dominant story, it becomes oppressive to other stories and possibilities. That's incredibly powerful. So fathering as a verb, we're getting to the top of an hour. And I just, from your experience with Journeyman, from your experience of building the Mug Club, what are some things to say to us dads out here around fathering as men's work? Here's that directive. You can be directive as a coach and say, hey, Dad, you need to
do this.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing I would say to anyone who's listening, including you, would be, we've been really energetic for this whole time. I'm going to slow it down and say, all right, when I say the word fathering, what comes to mind? What's brought up when we say fathering? We don't say father. I told you beforehand that I'm very strident about the fact that I'm not a parent coach. I'm not teaching you how to give your kids timeouts and get them to eat their veggies and go to sleep at night. I'm teaching us how to father as men, right? And to me, I'm curious, like any of your listeners, what does come to mind? And whatever that is, let's develop it, right? Fathering could be creation. Fathering could be caretaking. It is certainly, in my estimation, nourishment and nurturing. But it is also the guiding and guidance. When I started Journeyman, I spoke to probably about 60 fathers. I was doing R&D, and I just sort of said, tell me the origin story of you becoming a father. And I said, that could have been when you found out a partner was pregnant. It could have been when you signed the adoption papers. It could have been when you, got your first dog. I don't know. But when you identified, when your identity was impacted, that you became a father. For me, what was interesting is that I had many different layers of that. When I was 21, I started working at a residential treatment center where I lived with children for long periods of time. Now, I never thought of myself as their dads. That was a big deal, right? They all had dads or didn't, but it was never, but I was fathering their development.
Yes. And
so as a 21-year-old, there was something really meaningful in my own personal development and my identity that, I have the ability to impact the development of another human being.
Yes.
That's fathering, right? And what my supervisor, my very first summer said, in order to do that, you need to know yourself, right? A carpenter, a plumber, a chef has tools, right? And you have to keep your tools sharp and you have to keep your tools honed. But as a coach or a therapist, I'm the tool. And that's funny on a couple levels, but I have to, and as a father and as somebody who fathers, I have to have my tools sharpened. I have to have myself and my identity and my relationships sharp. And that's the work. I mean, look, I think I'm a good dad. I know about timeouts. I know about structure and all of those things, but I do all of them infinitely better when I'm more connected with myself, when I'm more connected with my partner, when I'm more connected with my values and direction, and with how I want to father the life that we live. If those things happen, the stuff with my kids, eating their vegetables, going to bed on time, that's much, I don't want to say easy, but it's a better path. There's a more clear path to go.
Thank
I don't know
you.
if that answers your question.
I think that's perfectly it. There's something that arises in me when I think about fathering as a verb, that what you said about they weren't even your kids, right? But you were, it's
Yeah.
a function. There's a function.
Yes.
And in order for the function to be healthy, it has to be in a broad context. It has to be in the context of self-awareness. It has to be in the context of a bigger picture for what we want. Like, so, it could, yeah, my dad teaching me how to change the oil in my 77 Nova. There was something about that. There was a fathering moment about it, because he was next to me, we're side by side in it. There's a bigger picture at play about what we're trying to achieve. And there was something gentle in it as well. Like there was something like, that's just an example. But for me personally, like fathering and presence, like that has been my whole journey of fathering, is learning how to get more and more present for my kids, right? At those critical moments.
Can I add to yourself too? For your kids and for yourself?
Because I have to have the self-awareness, right? Like that, the presence for me is like, rather than projecting my own fear, insecurities, or anxieties, or future projections, or all of that stuff onto my kids, it's like getting present with like what's happening right now with them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what a gift, right? Like what a gift on so many levels. You can be present, which means you can do the teaching and doing the parenting and doing those things. But at the same time, you're also modeling, I can do this. I'm aware. I'm, but my kids are, there's pros and cons to it, but both of their parents are therapists. and they're very smart, sensitive, verbal boys. And so, if I'm snappy, if I'm impatient, if I'm irritated, blah, 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 both of my kids will be like, hey, would you tell your journeymen to talk to their kids this way? Why are you acting like that? Slow down, Papa. And what a gift. What a gift to be able to hear that from from my own kids.
It's true.
And it's enraging sometimes, but it's a beautiful gift.
Thank you so much, Jason. So now we hit it. What do you want an action step? Where do you want folks to go who have been listening to learn more about what's coming up? Maybe frame the Mug Club here in a couple of minutes, and then tell our listeners where to go find you.
Wonderful. Yeah, no, that would be great. The frame is, and I'll do it as quickly as possible because I should learn how to do it concisely anyway. But the whole organization of journeyman, the metaphor is I get to be the innkeeper of a virtual inn. And going back to what you said, Lord of the Rings, where the whole thing was the foundation of everyone getting together and having a meal, or, I'm a Star Wars fan, the cantina scene, or, I have found out that in my life, while I love adventure fantasy stories, science fiction stories, my favorite scenes are at the inns and the pubs and the cantinas. And why is that? It's because that's where people step away from their adventure to get nourished, to be seen and to be heard and to share stories, to get new skills, to buy a new thing, to get information from the shady guy in the corner, right? Like the inn is where we then stop and grow and then get ready to go back out. So many other men's programs working on Hero's Journey are about, let's go somewhere, let's do something, let's get a treasure and we'll go home and be better for it. And there's value to that, no matter what I sometimes joke. But I turn it on its head, where it isn't we're going on an adventure together. It is your adventures at home with your family, your loved ones, your community, your work. The inn is where you get to step in, drop your shoulders and go, oh, I got to tell you, like, this is what's going on, and this is where it's at. And we sit by the fire, we share, some gruel, and we talk about it, and and there's some things to learn, and you get some maps, and all of those metaphors. Yeah. So that is the foundation of everything that I do with men. And so what I have just opened up after a bunch of years of running a program called Foundations, where guys would come and learn about different foundational adventures and how to work, I've taken that, we've turned it into more of an ongoing program called the Mug Club, where, leaning into the inn, everyone gets a mug, and we show up on the regular. There's a monthly theme every month, and in the beginning of every month there's a presentation where I'm either going to speak to people like you and do interviews or workshops, or myself present a particular thing that's on theme. And then throughout the rest of the month, everyone's split into smaller groups where people talk about themselves, and they enter the inn and they connect, either around the theme or what's going on for them. And so we'll do some cooking, we'll do some learning about all different types of fathering, but particularly it's men's work, and how do we gather and really share stories. So if people are interested in the Mug Club, what's wonderful is I've just opened it up last couple of weeks, and we've already gotten started and had some amazing meetings. It is open. There are spaces there, and you can go to connectedfathers.net and learn all about that. If you want to learn more about sort of the journeyman curriculum and model that I've developed, it's journeymanfoundation.com. And what I would say is that at this point, if you reach out, you'll get me. I'm the only one here doing it. And I'd love to hear anyone who's sort of touched by this topic. I spend a lot of time, just connecting with men who are like, wow, I hadn't thought about it this way, or I'd love to sort of play with these ideas. And, there's space in the Mug Club, and there's space, in the virtual world that I'd love to connect and hear more from people about how this lands with them.
Thank you very much. Jason Frishman, look in the show notes down below for the 2 web addresses that Jason just gave. And this has been, just like all of our conversations, so much fun and connected. Yes. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm really grateful. Thank you so much.
This has been the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. And I personally want to thank our guests for joining us today and imparting their wisdom from their experiences in this amazing journey called life. Now, the fee for this episode is simple. If you found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, remember that life doesn't happen to us. It happens for us, so long as we rip the pen out of fate's hand and become the author of our own story. So my friend, pick up the pen, and we'll see you next week. Lots of love.